So I've given you sort of the basics of what externalities do. Let's talk about what some of them might be to give you sort of more of a concrete example of what we're talking about. Let's start with some positive externalities. Attractive looking houses is one example, right? Something people just like to look at. That is a positive externality, right? They had nothing to say about how you designed your house, but if it looks nice, they can still enjoy looking at it. Bees have positive externalities, right? If you raise bees and they pollinate flowers, then that is an externality that is afforded to the people with those flowers, unless of course you charge them for it, in which case they would be part of the market and not external to it. Research and development has a lot of positive externalities. If you spend $1 million developing something, then either when somebody else, takes your research and works with it themselves, or when your patent runs out or whatever, then that research and development benefits everybody, even the people who had nothing to do with developing it in the first place. Purchasing health insurance could be an example of a positive externality. If you're a healthy person and you purchase health insurance, that makes health insurance cheaper to provide for the producer, which then drives down costs for everybody else. Another great example, vaccines have a lot of positive externalities, especially for communicable diseases. I don't know how that might be relevant to our lives, but that would be an example of something where we would expect that the competitive market itself would underproduce, right? Because we have a positive externality. So here's overproduction because we have a negative externality. We draw a positive externality. All right, so now we have a positive externality because the marginal social benefit is above the demand curve. Here's our market quantity, QC. Here's our optimal quantity, QO. And then we fill in, here's all the costs that we, by being here instead of here, we are underproducing, which means that we are, I'll get this one backwards. Yeah, here are all the benefits that we could have had by producing these all extra units, and we would have incurred these costs. So here is our dead weight loss. So let's talk about education as well. Education is a good example of a good positive externality to talk about because it's very clear to see that it has both private and external benefit, right? Goods with positive externalities don't have to just be for other people. They can also be for private people. They're just not entirely for the private person who makes the decision. So thinking about education, there's some obvious private benefits to education. People who choose to get educated or choose to provide education to others, there's some clear benefits there, right? Generally, that will lead to higher earnings in the labor market. That's a benefit that goes specifically to the people who are getting the education. There's also private costs, right? The tuition costs that are paid by people who have to go to, say, college, or if you're living in a place where the lower levels of education are not free, then you have to pay that as well. There are, of course, external benefits to education as well. There's a lot of evidence that getting somebody educated does a lot of stuff, like makes the economy more productive, for one thing, which is good for everybody, not just the individual person. It does things like increase civic engagement and participation. It does things like help reduce crime rates in certain areas. There's lots of different things that it can do that are external to the people who are actually getting educated themselves. It also does stuff like, we live in a society right now where pretty much everybody knows how to read. Not everybody, but nearly everybody knows how to read, which means we can do stuff like, have menus in restaurants that have words on them, right? That's something we take for granted, but that has not always been the case, that you could just do that at all points in time. And that makes our lives more efficient as people who do know how to read, because there's now words for us to read. You can assume that people know how to read, so you can write words down for stuff, for important information, which means that you can more easily digest that information, right? A person who knows how to read, that's a much more valuable skill in a world that writes for you. But if you live in the country or a period of time where the literacy rate was like 5 or 10%, then you're still going to be stuck on that sort of inefficient information transfer. So there's a lot of external benefits there. There are also some external costs as well to education. So one that might immediately come to mind is the fact that education is highly subsidized, right? Other people are paying for your education in a literal sense. Whether that counts as a negative externality, a little bit of a gray area, because they're sort of part of the producer market. They're just paying for it in a different way. That one's weird. Let's ignore it. But a definite negative externality is something like, hey, if you put a bunch of new people with higher educations into a labor market, that might push down labor conditions for people who don't have the education. They had no control over whether you got educated, but now their labor market's a bit tougher because of it. That is a negative externality produced by education. So then you got to weigh it against all the positive externalities and see which one is bigger, and that would tell you whether you're underproducing or overproducing education in a competitive market. The other thing to keep in mind, education being a good example, like I said, highly subsidized, right? The fact that education probably has positive externalities overall doesn't necessarily mean that we are over or underproducing it relative to where we are now. It just means that we would be underproducing it if it was produced in a competitive market. It's not, but if it was, there'd be too little, is what the conclusion is, right? So that's something to keep in mind. All right, so keeping all this together, all this externality stuff together in our heads at once, because the production of the good affects others, either positively or negatively, market participants will not incorporate all of those other external benefits and costs, which means that they're going to be choosing where their marginal cost equals marginal benefit, but that's not going to lead to a situation where society as a whole gets marginal cost equal to marginal benefit. Our true optimal amount is marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost, which society would like to get to, but society has no control over. A couple notes about this to keep in mind. The individual participants in the market don't particularly care whether we get to that optimum. That's a common mistake that I see students making when they're writing answers for this class. It's not that. So if you're a producer and you're trying to maximize your profit, if that incidentally gets you to the social optimum, fantastic, great. You don't really care. That's not the incentives that you are trying to follow. So the question is, so if we don't get there, it's not like you're going to make a different decision. Be like, shoot, we're not at the social optimum. I better produce less or produce more to get there, right? You're going to focus. The idea here is that you're focusing on your own incentives, and that we will, as a consequence of that, not be getting to this optimum, right? So this is something that happens or does not happen, not so much as it's like a choice or a goal that we try to get to with individual incentives, right? That's sort of a distinction there. Same thing as, the difference between maximizing efficiency or trying to maximize profit or something. Any questions about externalities at this point? Yeah.
When graphing in your two examples for the positive externality, you had the supply match, the MSC.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to be the same thing in that one, and then on the other side, they were the same thing with demand. Is that always going to be the case, or just significant?
So it won't always be the case.
Okay.
If there is no positive externality, then the demand and marginal social benefit will be the same. If there's no negative externality, then supply and marginal social cost will be the same.
Okay.